So it's my pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Professor Peter Verburg. He's over there. Please come to the stage. As most of you know, Professor Verburg is an internationally recognized expert in land use science and environmental geography. His research has significantly, it's too hard to speak, advanced our understanding of how land use change shapes biodiversity, climate, and sustainable development. So please welcome with me.
Thank you very much, and thank you a lot for the invitation. I'm not a researcher that focuses on agroforestry per se. So as Felix was saying on Tuesday, I'm not part of the bubble. And I was asked to give a perspective from the broader European land system of how that is developing and where opportunities are for agroforestry. At the same time, I have to disappoint you a little bit because I'm still part of the bubble, because I love trees, and also I'm one of the many amongst you that is also experimenting myself a little bit with agroforestry systems. Since a couple of years, I have the privilege of living in that white house there, and this is a picture of that house about 50 years ago. And in the back of the house, I'm developing and experimenting a bit with some agroforestry systems. But what you see in front is this classical system of meadows with old trees in it and livestock grazing around it. And when it gets hot, like on those days, all the cows will be found under the multiple trees. But in time, all these trees in this meadow have been crumbling down for many different reasons. And in the end, only the big tree you see there in the middle, the big linden tree, was remaining. And as we know, then agroforestry, this cannot support anymore the number of cows, so we had compaction of the land. The tree was in a bad state. So if you look at the tree in the current state, we see we had to fence off the land for avoiding the cows to be standing too much underneath the tree. So again, showing that if you have this kind of agroforestry system, you also have to maintain it in order to sustain it. And when you're in a degrading trajectory, it no longer works. But that's the micro scale. Let's now go a little bit to the top of the ladder of what Toby has just presented, of how do we get agroforestry systems to go at larger scales. And I will focus on the European context. And if we look at the maps produced, then what we see is that, yes, there are quite a few silvopastoral systems still, especially in Southern Europe, but agroforestry in arable systems is still very, very, very small across Europe. And a lot of those systems are traditional systems that are on a trajectory of decline in time still. At the same time, these traditional systems, what we try to do is to preserve them or restore them where possible. At the same time, we have the ambition to also establish more modern agroforestry systems, especially in arable lands, because we all know about the many advantages and the multifunctionality that they can deliver. But the problem is, how do we get that transition, that we move from the very, very slow growth that we see at the moment to a real rapid increase? Is it already warm enough to make people see the benefits of trees, or does it have to be getting warmer and worse? That's a bit of the question. So what would trigger this change that we would see this large-scale adoption of agroforestry? And for that purpose, I often use in my research the use of scenarios. And a lot of scenario work looks more at these more conventional worlds, where we change a little bit in the policy here, we do some reforms, some more subsidy schemes there, and we see some change. But the problem is that, and we all know it, basically to really get agroforestry up to scale, we have to change our value systems. We have to really see a transformation in how we deal with the land, how we deal with nature. So we need big transformations. But at the same time, we see on the upper hand transformations happening that move us in very different directions. And it's a problem of many scenario studies that we use to inform policies that we're always in this middle part, that we have a lot of bias of basically the continuity, because we base our understanding on how people at the moment make their decisions, and not how we hope that they would make their decisions and how their values should be focused for the future in order to basically survival of our civilizations. So rather than taking the point of doing a scenario analysis, in this talk I will start with using what we call a megatrend analysis to see what are the big, basically, drivers of change in our agrarian systems in Europe, with some outlooks also to forestry systems, and how can these megatrends that are happening be a game changer and which creates opportunities for agroforestry. So we will not look at all the different megatrends that are there, that I will focus on 4 different ones. And of course, what else can we start with if we're sitting in this hot room to start with climate change? And then climate change, if you go through the scientific literature and all the big assessments made for IPCC and IPBES and others with the big models, in the end, what we see happening there in the modeling, we often see even a positive effect on agriculture of climate change, higher yields and higher production. And this shows a little bit of oversight of where these higher productions are expected according to those models. But then there's also a little bit hidden in this diagram, this kind of shaded regions where drought risks are appearing, which can completely offset all these benefits that are calculated based on these crop modeling efforts of the longer growing seasons and the higher temperatures. So in a lot of the scenario work, we're very positive about this climate change, while in the reality, it's a huge challenge, of course, for farmers to actually reach those potential productions and not be suffering from the drought. Similar issues with forestry, where we see basically a positive effect, again, the first graph of the growth of forest because of a longer growing season. But at the same time, next graph directly showing that all over Europe, aridity will be a big issue, as well as the potential of winter storm impacts, not only because of higher wind velocities and more frequent storm events, but also because of a decrease in ice days, which a frozen soil tends to stabilize a tree while being in a forest event. So these are a bit the kind of the impacts of climate that may be expected. But then there's also a lot of evidence of how agroforestry can help on that. And there's a complex system, because locally there can be a microclimatic benefit of agroforestry in terms of reducing the local temperatures by providing shade. But at the same time, trees tend to evaporate more than a crop, which can lead to more local drought, while at the same time the higher atmosphere, the higher humidity in the atmosphere can lead to larger scale feedbacks of more rainfall again. So it's the effect of both precipitation as well as on the temperature depends a lot on the local context due to the effect of albedo and water balance effects. And there have been studies looking at the role of trees, but already also, which also is part of a lot of the agroforestry systems, is the more continuous coverage of the soil, which has also these large effects on water balance and temperature. So complex relations, but in general, positive relations for agriculture. And agroforestry as a way, but not as the miracle. If we look at the effects in terms of temperature, they will not stop the heating of the environment, of course. A second megatrend in European agriculture is that we are in general dealing with an old farmer population, and in a lot of regions, a further aging farmer population. But again there, and I'm a geographer, I see a lot of spatial variations. There are countries where we have relatively young farmer populations. There's also countries with older farmer populations, but there where we see younger farmers coming in, but there's also a lot of parts in Europe where we see little signs of younger farmer populations coming into the game. And these processes are often also a trigger for agrarian change. If there is very few successes of farmers, either this can lead to a marginalization of agriculture or provide opportunities for more industrialization of agriculture, with few farmers taking over a lot of the land, which is not always good news for agroforestry, because agroforestry is a more intensive practice that you cannot easily spread across very, very large farms. Then the values, and already Tobias talked a lot about values, and we see this polarization in Europe. On the one hand, we see this productivism coming stronger and stronger, with mega farms and mega stables spread all across Europe, very rapidly increasing. But at the same time, we see very much isolated in certain regions of Europe, we see this increase of alternative systems, and here the best documented data for the increase in organic agriculture as one of those systems. And these are opposing trends, but of course in terms of quantity, the enlargement in the scale of farming is still the very much dominant process as compared to the alternative farming systems, the post-productivism type of systems that we are looking at. And that's also what you see when you gather the data on what we see on the economic trends of farm size. So basically the colors on the top bar of the diagram, these ones are the dominant colors in Europe, and these are all showing an increase in farm size happening across Europe. Small farms are slowly decreasing. And this comes together with increases in field size and increases in the efficiency of management. And for efficient management, farmers often do not see trees as very beneficial. And as an example from the province where I lived myself, a province that had a lot of trees within the landscapes, both in terms of agroforestry systems, but also as small hedgerows, linear elements in between fields, that recent data analysis show that in a province where there were a lot of subsidies, a lot of initiatives to hand over trees to farmers, a lot of restoration initiatives, that in the end, the amount of trees that disappeared each year, 120,000 trees in agricultural land over the past 10 years that disappeared, are by far not compensated by all these well-intended initiatives and subsidies for planting new trees. So, in spite of all the efforts, we're still on the trajectory of scale enlargement and homogenization of landscapes. Another mega trend that we see, and already I think Tobias was showing the protesting farmers picture, and I will have one not from Germany but from the Netherlands for you in my presentation. But a lot of that is often related to environmental ceilings, environmental legislation. In a lot of parts of Europe, we're hitting ceilings in terms of the amount of nitrogen that is related to ground and surface water, pesticide production, greenhouse gas emissions, antibiotic pressure. So in a lot of regions we are hitting actually against our legal boundaries and that we have agreed on, or that are determining human health issues directly. And this is a trigger, often can be a trigger for change, but it's also a trigger for a lot of protest. And if you have to reduce your external inputs in a system, and you cannot use as many pesticides as you're currently using, you have the natural system and the natural environments in your farms to take over. And this is a meta-analysis of the literature that one of our postdocs did a few years back, and it shows how much semi-natural area do you need in a landscape, and then defined by 1 kilometer blocks, because that's the kind of the movement space of pollinators and a lot of pest control species. How much do you need? And from all those case studies that we analyzed, we saw that if you have less than 10% of natural elements in your landscapes, and a lot of European landscapes have less than this 10%, you basically do not see any significant support of these natural pollination, wild bees, natural pest control, but also the experiences, the values that people have with the landscape, or the water control quality regulation. Below 10%, you don't see a lot of that. Basically, from these data, you could interpret that if you have at least 20% of natural, semi-natural elements in your landscape, then you basically have the higher likelihood of supplying sufficiently of those services to keep your farms functional. And this is really, in some landscapes like the Jura, yes, you have that because there's a lot of patches of nature here and there, but in many European landscapes, and especially our high production landscapes, we are fully dependent on artificial measures, chemicals, in order to provide those services, because we don't have that amount of semi-natural land. Now, looking at all those megatrends, all those changes happening, what does that mean for agriculture? And what we did to try is to classify a series of 30 indicators of those megatrends in terms of what they would cause for agriculture. Some of them lead to a lock-in, a persistence of the current system to remain the same. Big farms relying on high loans with agricultural banks and other things, they are a very persistent system. It's hard to change that because the farmers are locked in. Some changes lead to more systematic changes, pushing the system to a different state, and others would lead to a marginalization of the systems. And if we map that out, we go to these type of maps, which shows that these different pressures are happening in different places across Europe in different ways. Of course, in some of the more remote regions of Europe, we see this marginalization being a very important process. In other regions, we see, especially when environmental ceilings are hit, we see this push towards a systemic change. But you also see a big overlap between these pushes for systemic change and the same regions we see a huge lock-in of the system in its current state. So in one way, there is a lot of signals that we cannot continue the same way. The systems will fail. But at the same time, the systems are very much locked into a persistent state. And that's a tension which causes a lot of problems for change. And that's also a tension why agroforestry often in those regions doesn't hit the ground really, because there's very few opportunities. There is a lot of people arguing for in those regions that we have to change, but the change is not really happening. So that leads to frictions in society, and there's my tractor picture, but also a need to really focus our efforts if we want to transition into a change to those regions where this tension is happening, because this tension also provides kind of a window of opportunity for fostering change by having the right policies and having the right push of civic society. Now let's have a look at these motivations for change again. And this is another meta study where we looked across hundreds and hundreds of different papers of what motivates farmers to implement sustainable practices. So this had studies of agroforestry, but also more studies of more smaller practices, organic agriculture, conservation agriculture, and so on included. And what you see as a surprise is that it's not the economic benefit always that is the highest. The economic outcome had, yes, a positive effect. It helps making the decision to adopt. But what we especially saw that these intrinsic values, these general attitudes, the intention that the farmer have with what he or she wants to achieve on the farm, and also the perceived behavioral control, the control people have on those measures, are very important to motivate people. But there's a lot of this type of research around, and this is the picture that you get from this research, that it's a complex social psychological process of adopting. But it's all focused on the farmer. But we know that's a bit of a naive perspective of looking at agricultural systems in Europe. And already I was very happy to hear that after Tobias' talk, all the questions were about the value chain. A lot of questions were about the value chain and the wider environment. Because the farmer is not always an autonomous decision maker. A farmer is also in a web of having loans with a bank, is a product of an education system, is having contracts with supermarkets, buyers, value chains, agricultural imports, input suppliers, long-term contracts. So how is this whole network, this whole social network of power that the farmer is embedded in, organized? Now again, we did a kind of a synthesis by looking at different papers of the more anthropology type of papers that have analyzed how is this decision-making in an agri-food network appearing? What are basically the relations between different actors in terms of power? Is it more like a one-way power direction, or if it's more a cooperative exchange of relations? How can you describe them? And how can we draw then a simplified version of what actor exerts what power on who in the network? And from all those case studies, we could draw these diagrams of how decision-making is happening and what's the role of different actors and the value chain and the state in those figures. And a few archetypes popped up. And the first one, and that's the dominant one in most European landscapes, is what we call agro-industrial control. There's the farmer strongly influenced by the regulations from the state and the corporate value chain, the CFC in this figure. And then you see also the value chain affecting the state, and in that way creating a triangle, a power triangle between state, corporate value chain, and the farmer, supported by educational systems that creates often a lock-in, a very stable system of decision-making and a lock-in in current systems. We also see a lot of systems where basically the state has become only a weak player and is the value chain that has been a dominance on the farmers by having long-term contracts and providing exact measures on what inputs and what farming practices to apply on the farming. So a very simplified system in which the corporate value chains are the dominant ones, having all the power in their hands for how agriculture is managed. But we also see other value chain systems where we see either the conventional value chain being more interactive with the farmer, with the state in a two-way direction, or we see systems where alternative value chains, local value chains, cooperatives are playing a more important role, and where also the farmer has a two-way interaction with those things. So more shared power and really go into alternative systems. And of course, and that's also very important in agroforestry, we have the civic food networks in which either there's a direct connection between farmer and consumer, or it goes through kind of a civil society organization or a collaborative that is having the possibilities to process agroforestry products with a direct benefit for the farmer and in collaboration with the farmer. So very different kind of power levels. So this is all about this who affects what type of power on other people. And power is the thing that is everywhere in society, and we don't like it. But it's a fact that we have to always acknowledge. And how do you shift from basically this lock-in into this agro-industrial power system towards these more alternative networks that also are enabling agroforestry to have a valid place? So we use some agent-based modeling to basically see how can we describe this system of who is affecting what element of the power and influencing, to see how can we shift to that alternative system, agri-food system, that has much more sustainable measures. And what we see when we try to implement these power networks, that in our baseline, we always see that when we run the model, we see the conventional markets winning and the alternative systems going down in time again, after even if there's many attempts to make it work. But we also managed to find configurations of the system, policy measures that enable this transition to much more alternative farming systems. And we tried different ways of how to make it work. And the positive news is that if you look at these diagrams, you would see that basically in the current situation, you would about having 40% of the farmers and value chain actors would have to change their norms and values in order to foster a transition to an alternative market system. But if you are basically try to take measures, policy measures, to reduce the path dependencies or to regulate the power concentration in the value chain, you can shift the system. And basically already when 20% of the actors is willing to adopt these alternative systems, we see a shift in the value chain, and basically we see the alternative systems taking over from the conventional systems. So this is a model experiment in which we try to see what kind of social dynamics and what kind of policy measures can you take to shift the system from this lock-in to an alternative system state. And also trying to map the indicators of that change. And then what you see across Europe, and this is a very rough kind of mapping based on the current state and the current level of civic society organizations, the number of signals we see across Europe. You see a very spatial variant pattern of the enabling environment for such transitions. Now, in my final minutes, also going back from this more work, of really looking at these mega trends and these deeper drivers of change, to also a more scenario-based analysis of how this would look like. And we use the kind of positive scenarios of the IPBES Nature Futures framework to simulate how would European land use look like if you would go for those alternative systems. And especially the nature as culture scenario is a scenario where we embedded a lot of positive gains for mosaic landscapes, as we call them. And mosaic landscapes include agroforestry. It's our landscapes with nature and agriculture interacting in a consistent whole, close to people. And that's very opposed to the scenario which comes more from the biodiversity, the hardcore nature conservation community that focuses on developing these protected area networks to conserve nature and is not so interested in what's outside of those protected areas. So we try to simulate those alternatives, looking at how the different priorities for biodiversity and ecosystem services affect the land use change, but then also, again, analyzing, but if that then happens, what does it deliver? And that has interesting results. So I will just show you some results. So these are these European-wide simulations in which, for these 4 scenarios, we simulated land system change across Europe. And the scenarios are the same in the amount of food that is produced. They're the same in the amount of wood that is produced. And they are the same in the type of policy measures, only the targeting of what areas, what parts of the landscape do you target with your policy goals are you doing. So very similar scenarios, but the outcomes are very different. It's all about how do you reach this nature positive future. Do you do that with people, or do you do that by separating nature and people, or different forms of focusing on more regulating services that directly benefit also a lot of people? And we analyzed, and then this is my last slide, and it's the most difficult one. We analyzed what would those alternatives then deliver. And on the bottom line of each of these indicators, what you see on the bottom line is the kind of the business as usual scenario, which has red bars for basically everything. We're in this trajectory of huge problems. It's a barbarization trajectory that we look at. Nature is losing out, and we will lose out. That's the current state, and that's and then all the scenarios, all these alternatives are better than our current trajectory. But then if we look in more detail, we also see large trade-offs. And the most surprising outcome is basically this first graph, the species richness. We believe this is really a scenario where, with all the scientific prioritization techniques that conservation biology has, we really try to expand connectivity areas, protected areas, restoration areas in the best way to protect as many species as possible. And we see we do a bit better than currently, but less in all the other scenarios that are much less species-oriented and much more people-oriented and have these more mosaic landscapes and other things. And this is because Europe is a continent of a lot of species are related to our cultural heritage landscapes. And if you don't focus on your policies on those, you don't protect those types. So it was kind of a surprise that our conservation biologists in the project didn't like. They really didn't want to have this as a publication in a way, because it was very bad for the lobby for protected area expansion. But it also shows that the scenarios and nature as culture as one, where we really have all these mosaic landscapes spread across Europe, agroforestry in many places, have a huge benefit also for species, but also for a lot of the multifunctionality that Tobias talked about on different services. There's trade-offs. Different strategies lead to different trade-offs, and different areas benefit more than other areas. But overall, it shows that for Europe, a strategy of really encouraging this transition to alternative farming systems that are more nature inclusive, that include trees, are the best solution. So, as the main conclusions, agroforestry cannot be seen from the overall trends happening in agriculture. If we isolate ourselves because of our love for agroforestry, because we believe we have the science that it works, we will not get there. There are so many powers in place to keep the persistence of the current system that we are not achieving it without having this broader perspective of what's happening in society and really making the change basically in the power structures that govern our agri-food systems at the moment, and really needing this transition. And with that, I would like to end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much for this very interesting talk. We have a few minutes left for questions. Are there any questions? I just see program flyers. Okay, down there. Microphone down there, please. Il faut un micro là en bas, s'il vous plaît. Voilà. Ouais, merci.
Yes, thank you, Peter. I think the two talks are very much aligned with each other, and I think the point of the letter of Tobias and you is the same, but I think the message for all of us here in the room is that with this broader perspective of we need to change from a value chain perspective to a value change perspective, and I think both of you give very interesting views on what value change can mean beyond value chain. Value chain is within the current system, how can we make use of it? Value change is being part of something that changes. And I think the ladder of Tobias, when you go up the ladder, your view is different. You might go up the ladder because the low-hanging fruit is done and you need a ladder to get higher. But I think the important thing is agroforestry itself and how we see it and how we define it has to change along with those broader perspectives. And I think that's the message for all of us here in the room. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I found this very impressive. It's an overwhelming pool of information, I think, and it was a lot. But I was always looking at two regions I know, and I had the feeling that a lot of these things you're showing are not just an estimate or something, they're really the core of the regions. And I was wondering, just pragmatically question, is there a portal or something where I can browse through the regions and have all these different trends in a summary, or are you working on something like this? Because I have the feeling when I start to work in a region and I don't know it, I come from outside, it would be very helpful to have this at hand to just know how this region in the megatrends may react. Of course, it's a future scenario. We don't know the future, but I had the feeling that it's very useful and necessary to look at. Not just like, oh, it's a cool study, but we have to use this data, I think.
Yeah, very good question, of course. So, yeah, a main part, there's a lot of issues that are the same across Europe, but there's also a lot of variations happening. And in implementing our system, but also in finding our trigger points, our leverage points, we have to look at that variation, because in some regions there might be kind of windows of opportunity for change that you don't find in other regions. And we are bringing together some of those indicators, some of those scenarios, and with the papers we try to always make it available open access to data. But especially on the more socioeconomic data, there's still huge gaps, and the proxies we have to use are always imperfect, I would say. Yeah, we are trying to make those data that we collect openly available with the papers that we produce. So you can find some of those things, but I'm also sorry we don't have a nice viewer with all the data around there. But because yeah, it's as a scientific group, maintenance of such things is always a bit of a challenge. Yeah.
Yes, hello. Hey. Hi, good morning. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. As a conservation biologist, I feel I need to react perhaps to some of the statements you made. I was not involved in the paper you mentioned, so I'm not quite sure what is the reason why the community of conservation biologists were not very happy with the results, but I wonder perhaps it's because species richness is one of the indicators that perhaps shows an increase in agroforestry systems, and that's also what we find in other case studies. But there are other indicators that matter, for example, composition and what species you actually find in this system. So my question is, how do you think this research can be done in a more interdisciplinary manner to take into account the nuances of each discipline to avoid making kind of superficial analysis that in the end will lead to potentially biased message? I don't know if and how this collaboration could look like under what platform?
Yeah, no, it was for us a kind of interesting analysis of looking how also among scientists, and as an interdisciplinary scientist, I'm always an outsider to the different communities, and it's then very interesting to also see more in the conservation community different values. Some people really going for real nature, wilderness nature, and the species in that, and protected areas are one tool for achieving that, and others very much focusing on nature for people, nature in living landscapes. And these are different species, sometimes the same, but also often different objectives. And it all relates to different value systems. In the end, nobody wants to put strongly in a corner. That's the good news. People see value in everything. But at the same time, in different disciplines, we have our different hobbies of things and our different beliefs in what instruments are working. And I think that's often a big problem, and that's what we see in the biodiversity community, a very strong focus on protected areas and expansion, while we forget about the working landscape where people live, where people need. But that's maybe an anthropocentric point of view from my perspective. But again, I think it's mostly also about human well-being that we're talking about, and we need species for that. But just protecting species can do also with humans, without humans. Nature will in some form survive. But values, and that's I think why it was, Tobias' talk was a very nice combination of talks this morning. These values are really important, and they are not always fully aligned, and we often, to make a point, we exaggerate in one direction or the other one, and then we start fighting each other rather than working towards the same thing. And I think that's also, as a scientist, that we have to learn how to work together to make a stronger point, to have the power, again, using our power in the system to make a transformation, rather than fighting each other on details of what's the best way of, what is the best measure to go for.
Okay, we take the two last questions, so the microphones are already in place. These are the last two questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I try to make it quick. Ulrich Schmutz, I'm a professor at Coventry University in the UK. In the UK at the moment, in Parliament, it's being discussed the Rights of Nature Bill, so nature as having rights in its own. And there's also a lot of work in the European Parliament on this. I found it really interesting, your description, and I just wanted to ask you to elaborate a bit more. So you have nature for nature, one of them, nature as culture, and nature for society. And you showed really very much differences there. So what's your view? Which one should we adopt? One of the three, or all three together? So, yeah, that's the question, which obviously can't be answered.
You already gave the answer. All three together, I think plural values are a strength of our society, and it's a resilience in our system that we have this difference in values. And we also tried one scenario where we bring aspects of these different value systems together and target more the instrumental values to the living landscapes and working landscapes, and the more kind of nature rights for itself to the more natural landscapes. And we see that that plural scenario, without extra efforts, but by better targeting of our measures to areas, wins in terms of all the indicators that we provided. So I think plurality in value systems is incredibly important. It's also what we have in humanity, and we have to foster it rather than fight it. And I think rights for nature as a legal instrument can be a very good instrument, especially to protect also what we have. Like my old tree, and every morning when there has been a storm and I wake up, the first thing I do is to see if my tree has survived the storm. But it's so hard to restore. This is a tree that has a history of 400 or 500 years. It has been regrowing and collapsing and so on. But you cannot replace that with something new. So giving a rights to what is now there as natural elements is very important.
Thank you. So last questions. Please keep it short if possible.
Thank you very much. Sorry for coming back to this point of nature for nature and the species richness, but I think it's a very critical message also to deliver. And I'm wondering what your assumptions are, because I hear this argument quite often that if there's no livestock anymore, then there will all be shrubs, and then there will all be beech forests and no species richness. But I think people always neglect that there are also animals that keep landscapes open. They have been, in some areas they are, but we still either force them to live in the forest or at high altitudes or shut them down to extinction. So, yeah, what are your assumptions? What happens?
Very good remark. In any of these large-scale modeling work and data analysis, we make tons of assumptions. And assumptions are a problem. The deeper I'm going into models that are used for big assessments, the more scary I get about climate change and other things, because a lot of the assumptions are sometimes over-optimistic because we're careful as scientists. It's a habit we have. And we simplify things, we miss processes that can be critical. So it's always a looking glass, and we know and we often hope that things turn out better than we predict, and not that they are worse than what we predict. And there might be good surprises. There's much more variation. As a geographer, you want to plug in as much variation in your models as possible, because we know average temperatures at the 2 degrees that we have now here, that's not a problem, the average. That's good for agriculture. It's this variation, these dry, hot spells that are the problem. And in models, we work with yearly time steps and all of those things that are assumptions that might affect your results quite a lot. And I think that's one of the most ethical responsibilities of a modeler, is to be very aware of what you're doing and still go out into the real world to not believe that your model is the real world, but to see the real world and learn from the real world to better inform your modeling skills. So, but it's something, it also affects my results, or even while we try to do the right thing. But I sent all my PhD students for one chapter to the field in order to avoid that they start believing in their models. But that's, I think, happening too much in society, and that's also sometimes why we make the wrong conclusions.
Thank you very much. Wait a second. So I would like to offer a small Swiss present also for you. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you very much.